So just to start off, we are going to this will be interview, but we will have time for questions at the end. And so, Lacey, if we wouldn't mind, just kind of start with like, how did 2040 start? How did the idea behind the Minneapolis 2040 Comprehensive Plan really begin?
Yeah, Jeremy, it's so great to see you. Thanks for having me. And I'm really excited to learn more about the work that your cohort is doing, the group of leaders that you're working with. Um, so uh, I'll just give like a little background on my story and how we came to start working on a lot of really exciting, big integrated issues in Minneapolis. Minneapolis is a city that's growing. Our population when I was in office was in the low 400,000s, like 420, 450,000 people. So a kind of medium-sized city with a pretty decent capacity, a planning department, a public works department, sustainability staff. So I know that isn't the case for everyone who might be listening or who work in their own communities, but I think, Minneapolis started getting a lot of national attention after we passed our comprehensive plan called the Minneapolis 2040 Plan in 2018. And one part of that plan looked at our zoning code and particularly looked at allowing more small scale residential density. So we ended up allowing triplexes citywide in every residential area of Minneapolis. And the headlines for that were like, Minneapolis eliminates single family zoning. And it started a big conversation, which I think is an important conversation. I think it's really exciting to see the way that our work, along with other cities, Portland and Austin, Texas, and others, were having really similar conversations around the same time. Um, but there's a lot of history behind those headlines. And those of you who've been in elected office for a little while know that's often the case, right? There's the headline, and then there's like all the details and all the things that are behind it. So I took office in 2014 and I served through 2021. I was in office for 8 years. And throughout that time, some of the biggest issues facing our community in Minneapolis were around housing and economic justice. When I first took office, there was a very particular housing situation in our city. We had more than 50% renters. The housing market didn't have enough rental housing for everyone who wanted to live in our city. And, rents were skyrocketing. Rents were really growing very quickly. And coupled with that, we had many decades of economic disparity, particularly along race. And so there were a combination of factors that were leading to really extreme pressure on renters in our community, a lot of displacement of renters, folks facing very large rent increases or displacement, very significant barriers to finding housing and staying in housing. And so during my first election cycle in 2013, those were the big issues that we're hearing a lot about on the doors as we were talking with folks. And throughout my time in office, it remained a big issue. So that was the context that we were dealing with. Minneapolis also had a lot of community support for issues related to climate. Although I would say that that grew during my time in office, and there's a lot more, I think, visibility around climate issues and a lot more kind of visible support for that than when I first took office. So for us in the beginning, it was really about just thinking specifically about how we were approaching climate policy. It was really about finding alignment between things we know that affect climate sustainability and the like really important issues in our community at the time, which was around a lot around housing. And one of the biggest places of alignment for us was that there was a lot of demand in our city for neighborhoods that were really well served by transit and generally pretty walkable and bikeable in terms of the land use. So generally, our city had a decent starting point for homes near destinations like jobs, schools, shopping. But there was a lot of room for improvement in all of those factors. So, one of the big opportunities for us was how do we both help address this housing crisis that was really happening in our city, meet the needs that folks had for their own mobility and access to get around their community, and particularly in ways that didn't contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, like transit, walking, and biking. And then align that with like the bigger picture of all the other things that were happening in our community.
Thanks for that. I would add, like one thing I was always impressed with is that you brought that to the forefront. Like whenever you started talking, you were right on message about like these are the issues we're facing, and I think that that really helped paint that picture of what else was possible. But I would emphasize like it's also something like it's very hard for some of these other cities to not just try to address this one piecemeal problem, but to think bigger, to think about like doing it through the whole comprehensive plan. Like you're not in essence just saying, okay, we want to make sure that we have more senior living. We want to make sure everyone has living. So how did you really paint that picture? How did you kind of talk about it being possible and also just not overwhelming?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can get really overwhelming very quickly, especially as a policymaker to kind of know where to start. So I think, it depends a lot on the local context. And even within a city, which neighborhood are you in? You know, what are the particular contexts and challenges? And also, what is the life experience of literally every person you're talking to as you go? And when we talk about housing and mobility and neighborhood design, anything that affects the built environment in people's neighborhoods, it causes a lot of stress. A lot of people are already under stress because of economic issues, like I talked about, that were happening in Minneapolis. But the idea of change can be really stressful for people. And I think one of the biggest challenges in climate policy is to honor that life experience and hear people's fears and their dreams, both about like how they get around their community and how they're going to pay rent next month or their retirement that they're worried about, like those day-to-day issues, and then know when it makes sense to like explicitly tie that in with climate policy or where that's just information that you're gathering. And as policymakers, both elected and as department leaders, staff leaders, I really think we all have a big responsibility right now to kind of keep that big picture in mind and also figure out what is making the most sense for each community at the time. And there's so many ways to start and build momentum. For us, it was a couple of little, not little, but smaller zoning changes. They were significant and they were controversial, but we looked at how do we start to allow more housing in neighborhoods across the city. So we started by legalizing accessory dwelling units. We started sort of introducing the idea of opening up more housing opportunity in neighborhoods, especially those served by transit. And then we looked at parking requirements because in Minneapolis in particular, and this is again something that many more communities are talking about now, but we identified that as a local challenge because we had a lot of smaller sites in the city that were, a, for a lot of reasons, a great place to build smaller infill apartment buildings or mixed use developments. But our parking requirements were a really huge barrier to getting some of these smaller housing projects built. And so there was a lot of alignment around the impacts of loosening our parking policy. If you talk to folks about what kind of housing they wanted to see in their neighborhoods, they didn't like big, boxy buildings with hundreds of units. They preferred these smaller scale buildings. And we have a decent system of transit, some level of destinations within neighborhoods, where supporting more housing in these places made sense for a lot of reasons, including climate. But for folks, to kind of make that connection, like, oh, if we start requiring a ton of parking in every new building, it means we can't build an 8-unit apartment building or a 16-unit apartment building. It's just we've made it illegal. And so one of the big themes from our early work in Minneapolis was kind of really getting at what do people really want and where is their alignment between our values, which is like our values as a community are we want to be inclusive, we want people of all ages and backgrounds and economic backgrounds to be able to live in our community and thrive. We want to do our best to fight climate change at the local level. These are pretty widely supported ideas, but then tying that to like parking in a building is kind of the art of leading on climate policy, I think.
I'd love to go a little bit deeper on that point because I think that it's really important to be building momentum with, quote unquote, smaller programs. But as you and I both know, even these smaller changes, what can get community pushback. And I mean, I think that there's a lot of communities that thought they would just change an ADU policy and all of a sudden there's yard signs and people are upset. Can you talk about like how do you balance that part and that pushback with the education and the community building that happened in Minneapolis where you did get the pushback, but you also galvanized people for housing that they wanted in the community they wanted.
I think this is one of the advantages of an incremental approach is that it helps you sort of gather, it helps you identify concerns and it helps you gather support and build a coalition that is really necessary for big citywide change. So with the ADU policy, the accessory dwelling unit, this would be adding a second unit within an existing home or adding a cottage in the back on a residential lot. There was a lot of support from different partners in the community. So the national AARP organization supports accessory dwelling units as an official organizational policy. They work with folks, it's 50 plus is their age range, which feels very young to me. But they work with older adults and have identified a lack of housing options for folks who are getting older as one of their big challenges for the population that they support. And so that having that constituent partner, the constituency for this policy conversation, along with younger renters or a bigger, more diverse group of folks who are interested in policy change, really helped kind of, I think, identify ways to bring these policies through council. Because in Minneapolis, the city council is ward based. So each of the 13 city council members in Minneapolis represents a particular geographic area. And of course, within them, there's diversity in each ward, but across the city, we tend to have pockets of higher income or lower income, less or more racially diverse, less or more economically diverse. And so having a bigger tent of supporters from different parts of the city, different age ranges, different economic ranges, really helped us bring policy through council. And one of the things I learned early on as a council member is that, I get one vote and there's 12 other people and they get one vote. And there are things that I can do to help win over my colleagues. I can be charming and kind. I can build relationships. I can bring data and information and can make a compelling argument. I didn't really do this, but you can trade votes and, be more politically strategic. But at the end of the day, the most powerful way to get a vote is to have that person's constituents support the thing that you're trying to do. And there really, at the end of the day, isn't a lot you can do to get around that relationship between elected official and their constituents. And so the broader the base of support for all of these policy changes, the better. And starting with these smaller incremental changes is one way to start to identify and build up that base of support.
Well, that's great. I think one thing, just to keep on this for one more question, both of us were the chair of the zoning department, so or the zoning and planning committee. And I think one thing I learned there is that you can listen, you can make compromises, you work on appeasing everybody. And there's a constituency that just will not ever say yes. And they will bring everything up, all of these very good reasons for development not going up, but they're being brought in bad faith. But I did what I think was different with the 2040 was there was a real wedge between the bad faith arguments and the folks that were bringing these arguments in good faith. And if you could talk a little bit about like how did the education really splinter that group? It was they were all on the same side, and then the part that were like, no, this is compromise actually addresses my concerns. How were they kind of folded in and brought into the eventual 2040 plan?
Yeah, so the Zoning and Planning Committee is a body in Minneapolis that has city council members, other elected officials, but then there are folks who are appointed by the mayor and council. And the way the system worked, the short version is anyone in the city can appeal any development project to the zoning and planning committee, which many people did. And one of the things that our comprehensive plan, the Minneapolis 2040 plan, did was address a system which applied to housing, but also transportation decisions, which was very parochial when I first took office. Like every council member from each ward was kind of like in charge of their geographic area of the city. And a lot of decisions that affected the whole city and frankly the whole region were being made very piecemeal. And they were being made in a way that really elevated privileged voices, folks who had a lot of time to attend a ton of meetings, folks who were on their neighborhood board, folks who had specific training as lawyers or architects or some kind of professional capacity to be able to engage in this decision, project by project decision making. And one of the big things that we were able to do through the 2040 plan and other policy changes was to start to say, what are our citywide goals and how does this system fit in? So that what are the kind of baseline things that we want to make sure, for example, housing is meeting in our city, so that we weren't having different building materials on different projects depending on what neighborhood they were in, or different levels of affordability, the way we were doing affordable housing policy, the size of buildings, all these things. We really, in Minneapolis, because of that context, getting this shift to more of like, let's set citywide goals and make sure our implementation, like our zoning code and the way that we're building streets and our budget, that all of these things are aligned with our citywide values. There was a huge shift in our city, which helped depoliticize every decision. Like, should we build one apartment building on this particular street corner, and how tall should it be, and how much parking should it have? Which became this micro political fight for every single new housing project, which, like you said, Jeremy, made it really easy for people to, stop all new housing from being built, or stop housing from being built in one particular neighborhood, or request changes that made housing significantly more expensive, and price people out of communities. So I think for us, kind of shifting to more of this citywide policy approach helped address some of that inequity and how the process was working.
One thing I was really impressed with on the 2040 plan was that, staff was on board. And it was not something that happens in every city. It's not something that happens overnight. If you could talk a little bit about just how it got there. I think one missing piece of context for folks is that the zoning code wasn't, it was something that was piecemeal, that it was very laborious for staff to do that, and very, very frustrating when they would put their best work forward just to have some neighborhood member, pick apart things that were legally required, and to just have to go through and explain the process every single time any new development was happening.
Yeah, I think the partnership and the relationship between elected officials and staff is such an interesting dynamic, and that the way that big change happens in community is when there is as much alignment as possible between elected officials, staff leaders, and enough of a constituency in the community, the broader community, to sustain change over time. And all of that takes a lot of work. It takes work listening, really listening to what are the staff who've been there for 20 years saying, and why are they doing things a certain way? What are communities' hopes and fears? And just really, I can't emphasize enough how many conversations it takes to build that alignment. It doesn't just happen. And so every time I see a big thing happening in a city, or any big policy passing, for thousands of conversations that happened probably over many, many years to get a community to a place where they're making what looks like a groundbreaking change. But it was really like a very, usually a very long evolution. And I think one of the biggest challenges as leaders in any role is, when do you really push and really make big change? And when do you slow it down and listen? And that is always a tension. And I think the other big question to always ask is I think as we look at public policy, one of the biggest fallacies is that there's so much deference to the status quo. There's so much deference to this is how we do things, which isn't analyzed in the same way as a proposed change tends to be analyzed. So say you're a city council member and you're like, hey, I want to look at accessory dwelling units. Often the reaction is to ask a bunch of questions about what would happen if we allow a new thing to happen. That same level of scrutiny often isn't applied to what's happening today. And in our city, and I know in so many cities around the country, what's happening today is leading to inequity. It's leading to climate change. It's leading to things that people in our communities don't want to have happen. So there's a misalignment between where we're putting resources, where we're putting energy, how our budgets are structured, how our zoning laws are structured, how our capital improvement program is built and developed, all like a million decisions that are happening over time, which are leading to these problems. And so I think as leaders, one of the things that we can do is start to apply the same level of scrutiny to how things are today and the day-to-day of how staff are spending time, the baseline of our budgets, the way we're doing engagement or not, and really investigate how those things are aligned or not with the outcomes we're trying to get to in communities.
Well, that's great background. And I think for the next couple of questions, I just want to focus on like what would a city do to do that? So we've
Yeah.
got another comprehensive plan coming ahead for every single city. Um, so let's say they've done the work to work with staff. They've talked about what they want. They've listened to community. What other things do they need to think about? What other things do they need to think about in their budget? Do they need to think about long term? What's going to happen after they've decided that this is our comprehensive plan? Like how do they push that plan as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think if communities have the chance to take a more comprehensive approach, it's it's always a great opportunity if the community's ready, if there's, if staff capacity is there. For us in Minnesota, in the Twin Cities, in Minneapolis, communities are required to do comprehensive plans. They're not required to do all the things that we did. So we used it as an opportunity to really tackle these big picture policy questions. I think one of the things that we did that I would always recommend is we did our best to protect staff. So we were asking a lot of the staff leaders in Minneapolis who are brilliant leaders. Um, and this work wouldn't have happened without the leadership from planning staff and from other staff in the city. And we needed to protect them. We were asking a lot of them. The community was asking a lot. So one of the things we did was we brought all of these decisions incrementally through the city council for official approval. And this might look different depending on the structure of a city, but I felt like it was really important to, we discussed as a body, the city council, how we wanted to do engagement for our plan. It was important to do diverse engagement with a broad, sort of citywide approach rather than going to like the same people who always get a chance to be heard. But in order to do that, we really needed to change how we were doing engagement. And so we brought that through the city council. We voted on it. Staff brought us an engagement plan. They said, here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're not going to do. The council voted on it. So we had their backs as far as what were the limitations on their time and how were we going to approach engagement. Then we approved a goal and vision, or vision and goals. Sometimes that part doesn't feel meaningful. It's like some words on a page, but we made it meaningful by being careful about what those words said and making sure that all the council members actually agreed. We just paused. And then we wrote 100 policies in our plan. Again, we paused and made sure that people were still on board. We were bringing everyone along with us. We gave community time to respond and to give feedback. All of these pieces were also going through our planning commission. And it mattered who was there. It mattered who the council had appointed. It mattered who the mayor had appointed. It mattered which council member. Schrader, in my second term, was there on the planning commission like every 2 weeks, making sure that the stuff stayed on track. and that people were coming along, all of these different bodies and organizations. So by the time we got to the part where staff presented a zoning code, or it wasn't a code, that came later, for our plan, a framework for our zoning, we had done a ton of actually official council actions that had public hearing, and people had a chance to weigh in. So the map was not the first thing that people saw.
No, great. And what I'm going to try and do is summarize all of that. And so I'd love your feedback on is if this is the really short version of how 2040 happened, of just like there was finally, it seemed like community interest in zoning. And in Minneapolis, it really happened at a very unique time where renters were starting to organize and have a voice and talk about what they needed for a city that was not providing that. Our zoning code, like there was enough desire, there was enough pointing to empty parking lots of why are we not building on this? And that pushed people to get more involved in the process. More concerned people were joining the planning commission. And I would say, having elected officials like yourself, like saying the things they wanted to hear. They were there, you heard their concerns, you were voicing their concerns. You lived in their community, like to be able to have all of that come together and then to have staff, it's something that staff is not immediately going to trust you. Like it took time for them to see you, to see every elected official, vote for and support development, to push back on the pushback, and then to come forward with a plan. Like that plan took a lot of trust. Like the last part of after this, I want to kind of talk about all the things that made 2040 special that don't get media headlines. And how that actually, in a way, led to the big headlines. But I think the last thing on kind of the story of 2040, when that all came, there was something that every council member was invested in, the staff was invested in, and we were all kind of on the same page, and we were all very new. I think the other bit of the context was, because of your leadership, and others on the city, those that have been in planning commission and have been involved for a long time, they're able to shepherd the rest of us into here's what the plan is, here's why it's needed, and here's what we need you to do.
Yeah, part of why it was so important to bring those things through incrementally was that we had an election in the middle of our plan, and where every city council member and the mayor were up for election, and there was significant turnover. So because we had done so much community engagement, there was enough of a base of support from just, folks, regular people, the community, the broad community, as well as a ton of alignment in our advocacy community from groups who were focused on racial justice, economic justice, housing organizations, transportation advocacy groups. They really even got to know each other. And because we had the opportunity to do this more comprehensive citywide plan that looked at all kinds of topics, these advocacy organizations were able to really align into this. What it gave a place for us to organize all of this different feedback that we were hearing about topics that are often organized separately because of how nonprofit funding works and because of how agencies are structured and different funding sources happen. I think one of the most exciting things about being an elected official is that you get to take that 30,000-foot view, and you get to see, like, hey, the folks who are advocating for worker protections are actually talking about the same issues that the housing advocates are talking about. And this actually has a lot of implications for how our city contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. And it takes some time. You can't do that in your first week in office. But over time, you know, being able to see that big picture and to get to know folks and build these relationships gives you a chance to bring together different areas of work in a way that I think is very unique to serving as a local elected official. So on those days that feel really bad and you're like, why did I even do this job? Because there will be some of those days. That is the thing that I think is the most extraordinary opportunity. And even if you never author one thing that passes the body in your whole time in office, you can do so much of that groundwork that leads up to that one vote that gets the headline that is so meaningful and has to happen. It has to happen one way or another, whether it's elected officials leading it, whether it's grassroots community leading it. It happened in every community that has passed meaningful change. Someone did that work to build support and to find alignment and bring people together.
Like I keep trying meaning to go to my last question, but you keep saying great stuff. So I have a follow-up on that. Because I think one thing is that everybody was doing their part. Like it wasn't just we had a great planning commission, we had great staff, we were able to elect, a pro climate, pro density majority. All of those things were true. And it took work to get all of that there. And I think it was also amazing to come into a body and have like all of us represented different communities and we focused on our communities and brought that to the plan. And I think that that's something that it doesn't get a lot of attention of just like how all of it came together to make 2040. Like you've mentioned a lot of it was an instance of timing, but I think that's part of it too. Like it was, and it was just amazing how these groups can come together. So I am going to run us on to our last question, unless you had any kind of response for that.
Well, I think it kind of goes back to what you said at the very beginning of our conversation, which is that a lot of communities are facing the same challenges, and it may feel tempting to kind of pick up a particular policy from a different place, whether it's Minneapolis or somewhere else, and but we really were responding to the very specific things we were hearing in our community, and that's why we were able to ultimately pass not just, we had some divided votes while we were in office, but generally speaking, the zoning and the transportation policies that we passed were unanimous or nearly unanimous, and even over multiple election cycles have remained that way. And typically over time have even gotten more accepted. So that first parking reform vote that I authored in 2014, we had to make some compromises. We did only near transit, which was a policy, it made sense to remove parking requirements near transit for policy reasons, but it was also a political map of our city of council members who felt comfortable removing parking requirements. So we did a half parking space. So anyway, the details don't matter as much as the main point, which is that we took an incremental approach, which was more controversial at the beginning for a smaller change. But by the time we got to voting for eliminating parking requirements citywide in Minneapolis, it passed unanimously. I don't even know if the newspaper covered it. There was like a tiny little story on page 6. So we went from on many of these, pick any of the themes, front page stories, lawn signs everywhere, big controversy, a lot of drama, to it just became part of the accepted way of how we're doing things as a city. So, that also takes time. Things feel hot and then they kind of cool off.
Well, and I think one of the reasons things cooled off is just all the intersectionality in the 2040 plan. Like when you started off, you say the one thing we got news for was limiting single family zoning, and there were hundreds of policies put in there. And I think part of the strength of that is one thing I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts and a little more talking about it. Like going big has its advantages. Like talking about density in the terms of affordability, in terms of environmental sustainability, like all of these things play off of each other. And so no matter where you lived in the city, no matter what your community was asking for, there was a reason to vote for the 2040 plan, whether that be increasing transit, increasing local businesses, or just increasing like the reduction of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about kind of how that all kind of came together and kind of how it played out, like how pushing for very smart growth and smart density, it really brought in these other issue areas.
Yeah, I think one of the advantages of taking that bigger approach, doing this comprehensive plan, was that it gave space for us to respond to all these different things that we're hearing from community. And, throughout that process, climate became a much more explicit goal that people were talking about. I think in our final public hearing in 2018, I bet half the people who testified specifically talked about climate change, which wasn't the case even in 2014 when we started this work, right? And so things shift over time. Um, and frankly, in that time, like housing has become, the housing market has shifted too. So I think the advantage of it is to be able to hold that big picture along with how these details are affecting people's lives. And the way we did engagement for the plan was citywide. We did some small group conversations, we did big public meetings, but we were always asking people not about like what zoning do you want your house to be, of course, but sometimes that's a that's what the conversation jumps to. But how do you get around the city? How is it working for you? What is your experience in housing in our city? Like, what is your life like? And is it, how do you want it to be? Um, and so that we could do our job as policymakers to align those things better. And so I think, again, the piece that can get overwhelming is that you're hearing a lot of detail from a lot of different people, and you have inherently different power in your whatever city you're in, that you have to navigate. And so, I don't think there's any one formula, but rather, whenever change is happening, it's about navigating, what are things, I feel like there's like buckets, like what are things that are broadly supported where we can find a lot of alignment, and how do we just make that happen? And then where are there places where we need to really elevate the voices? Like it is the right thing to do to elevate voices that are not typically part of conversations. And how do we do that very explicitly so that we're all in alignment? So that when we ask people to come share their stories or to come testify at a public meeting, we're in a place to actually respond to what we're hearing from community. And in working through that shift in our city in particular, Minneapolis, was another thing that was happening in the background of all of this. When I first took office, there were groups and organizations and individuals who had an enormous amount of influence. They picked up the phone and the council did what they said, honestly. And by the time we were leaving office, I feel like we had done a lot to shift that so that City Hall was more open, people had more trust, there was more authentic response. Of course, there's an enormous way to go, and Minneapolis has been through a lot in recent years, which is very painful, and still a lot of work to do. But I think that comprehensive approach allowed us to take that longer term view and to really kind of find that sweet spot that were things that we could get done immediately. Like it was really important for us to adopt some of the zoning changes. So we adopted some of the zoning changes the day that we adopted the plan. So we legalized triplexes citywide. We allowed more dense housing near transit throughout the community. For the first time ever, our comprehensive plan had a map of the whole city, which showed basically how big buildings should be in each lot in our whole city, so that it removed the guesswork of, should this building be 4 stories or should it be 30 stories? And there's a whole separate conversation about the dynamics that created before, where like there was all this speculative development and no one really knew how tall buildings would ever be. The policies in the plan really looked to link transportation and land use so that we were making it more possible for people to live near the destinations they wanted to go. And we were investing in bicycling and walking infrastructure so that it was safe and people could actually get around through non-polluting methods. We focused our growth near transit so that that was more of an option for people, again, to look at how can we reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that are coming from driving, from personal vehicle use. Councilmember Schrader did a ton to integrate green building standards and to start to investigate like where were the barriers at the state level, but what could we do locally through our own building code and zoning policies to support green buildings and green site development. As we started to allow for more housing development, we incorporated affordability requirements in that new housing. So we were making it easier to build, but we wanted to bake in affordability requirements at the same time. We really were able to bring together a lot of the themes that we heard from community in that one plan.
Right. Well, that is a great note to end on. I did want to leave a little bit of time for questions, but Lisa, I just want to thank you so much, for sharing your knowledge with everybody. So we've got some time for questions. If folks want to come off mute, we can take a couple questions. Right, Tim, it's a small group. I can see you're up mute if you wanted to jump in.
Um, First of all, yeah, thank you very much for your talk and for pulling this all together. So I'm the administrator for the Office of Community Sustainability in Howard County, Maryland, which is sandwiched between Baltimore and Washington, D.C. So we don't have any incorporated municipalities in our county, so it's pretty much county driven as far as the land development plans and whatnot. One of the questions that I had was, uh, did you find yourself sort of in that tug of war between the advocates for affordable housing, including builders who say that that's what they're all about, is building affordable housing, even though they often will pay at least here they can pay like a fee in lieu, basically, of having to actually provide the affordable housing. But they use that sometimes as an invisibility cloak to say, don't bother us with green building standards and that sort of thing, because we're trying to provide affordable housing.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm kind of wrestling with that because I think we can promote climate action and smart development, and cleaner, more efficient, and healthier homes at the same time. I don't think they're mutually exclusive, but oftentimes it seems that they're presented as being mutually exclusive goals. I don't know if you confronted that kind of a dynamic there in Minneapolis. But the other question I had was, between that sort of pull in one direction, and then I think you touched a little bit on the blowback that would come from the community and the advocacy folks, um, who sometimes I feel can be real purists and who can't take yes for an answer and understand that sometimes we have to make progress incrementally. And I was gratified to hear your comments about making incremental progress, because I worry sometimes that we have purists in the community who will say, if it's not perfect, then it's no good. And so I'm just kind of curious to know how, whether on the planning commission or on the city council, how you manage to navigate those sort of competing uh, pulls and pushes from different parts of the spectrum.
Yeah, these are great questions. Didn't you just win like the best in the nation complete streets policy in Howard County recently?
Well, we got the NACO award also. We got a bunch of NACO awards, National
Yeah,
Association of Counties. And I think we were best in category with our HOCO by design
that's
general
awesome.
plan, which was our
Yeah,
Department of Planning and Zoning, which we work closely with. My office is more of a kind of a intersectional office across the administration. But we launched a climate action plan a year ago that we've been taking a whole of government approach in carrying forward. So we work pretty closely with our Department of Planning and Zoning and Department of Public Works and all the other departments across the administration. But I came from a previous career. I was 30 years in the federal government, and then before that, as being an environmental planner in California. So I sort of coming here as both as a citizen and as a former activist in the community, trying to figure out how we can drive this forward and deal with the kinds of
yeah.
competing challenges that we've seen here. And I'm just curious to know whether and how you manage to sort through lots of those pushes and pulls.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of ways to answer this question, but I think one of the things that felt important to me was to understand what is the very root of what people are asking for. So, for example, with the 2040 plan, there was a lot of fear about displacement, and there was a lot of fear about if we made it easier to develop or if we made it easier for single family homes to be transitioned into duplexes or triplexes, that it would lead to more displacement. And that is happening. That is a legitimate concern, and something that we had a responsibility to respond to. And so I think, again, you're trying to bring a big policy through a body that has a lot of different, you've got in our case, 13 council members, you're trying to find that sweet spot. So for us, it was non-negotiable to adopt those affordable housing requirements along with the zoning changes, the comprehensive plan. That was actually something where we had some conversations between policymakers and staff where staff didn't feel we were ready to bring an inclusionary zoning policy forward. They were really concerned about the impacts that the policy would have on housing construction, and they felt like it was kind of counter to the direction that we were going of making it easier to build housing. So we had a lot of back and forth conversations about how to incorporate that really important equity and anti-displacement piece into our overall approach. I think ultimately we went a little farther than staff and some other stakeholders would have wanted around bringing in those affordability requirements, and we didn't go as far as folks in the community wanted, as in terms of really emphasizing anti-displacement. At the time, there was, for example, a lot of energy around pushing for rent control, which had all kinds of legal challenges and a lot of additional political pushback. So, I think it's a really hard thing because the biggest challenge, you have to have some support base, right? Like the whole point of this one vote per council member thing is these organizations and people who are helping organize are the ones who are helping people communicate with their council members that they support something. And folks who oppose change are often more vocal. It often does require some organization to get folks who support change to reach out and to make their voices heard. And so you need those partners, you need those community and advocacy partners to be enough in support of something that they're not also trying to kill it. Because if you have folks opposed and folks in favor of something, both opposing it in the end, it's not going to pass.
Right.
So I think it's ultimately in the end about relationships and building trust and demonstrating over time that if you say that you're going to follow up and continue to push for things that you don't have votes for, that you do it, that you do your best. I also think there's sometimes a misunderstanding that, like, as one council member, if you just cared more, you could get more done. Or, I found that the more policies I authored and led, the more I was asked to do, to the point where I just couldn't, I was so overloaded that I became very burned out, honestly. And I should have said no to more things than I did, if anything. So I think that's the biggest challenge is, helping build that sustainability in both as far as policy change in the community, but within the body, and making sure that folks who are champions for policy change, either can sustain the work themselves, or that there's a pipeline and enough support for new voices to come in. Yeah.
We got two quick things, Tim, and then I'm going to go to Matt. It looks like you might have a question. But on that, like, I think what was really helpful was to not get between staff and advocates. Like, they weren't adversarial, like, cannot be adversarial. It can't be, it's their fault. But how do you have staff's real concerns and support those concerns, and at the same time bring that to community? Be like, look, I'm not just making that up. I'm not just being a power broker. I'm like, you're here. I'm just bringing snacks. You all talk it out a little bit. Like, and that was really helpful to see that, everyone was pushing as hard as they could. Like, they were really concerned. And it worked both ways. Like, I was also using the advocates to push for more affordable housing, like on the inclusive financing. Like, I brought in a community attorney who was like, sue the effers. And I'm like, okay, that's gonna go great. But it did have the impact that pushed our city attorney to be like, okay, maybe I could be a little bit stronger on this. It's like, yeah, you can. But also on sustainability, like, we didn't really, like, Lisa didn't touch on that, but Lisa and I were at a meeting where we came in and we were like, okay, affordability is great. Now, what about sustainability? And staff was like, yeah, we got nothing. We just don't have the leverage to be able to ask for sustainability. But that said, that was a while ago. I think their framing was that's too expensive, the market can't handle it. That's not true anymore. Like, there's federal funding, there's grant, all of these things have come down in price. And also, I would say, like, it's it's partially a lack of imagination where they're like, well, Jeremy's going to want solar and storage. I'm like, and I do. I would take like some green policy. I would take composting. I would take like something that is much smaller dollar amount that
Yeah.
they can do now. And I would definitely say work on that incrementally. And while that would be a goal, what we did pass, like this is what Lisa was talking about, authored a sustainable building policy, but it was only for new buildings that we put money in. You know, the city put the money in, so we had a say on what standards we could allow. And some of that you're going to bump up against state building code and other things. So,
Right.
and
We
Tim,
also
that doesn't
did,
yeah,
oh,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. Well,
Well,
we
I was just
also
going to say,
built some of those, some of the things that you ultimately, we wanted to do, but were preempted or whatever wasn't in our purview. Um, I feel like we could talk about zoning for many hours, but I think the advantage of a site-by-site negotiated approach to land use and zoning policy is that you can talk about each project and negotiate the specifics of each project with a developer. The downside of that is that over time, you probably are not getting the right public benefit out of private development. And I think we have really limited tools at the local level to leverage private development for public benefit. We're often preempted from creative solutions. Like my constituents, I represented a very, dense part of the city with a lot of transit, a lot of destinations, a lot of housing, mostly renter. And my constituents were like, we're seeing all this development, but we're not getting any benefit. We're not getting any public space benefits. There's not a better transit service. And they were right. There was a huge disconnect between what we wanted to do, which was invest in transportation systems in neighborhoods that were growing, and the tools that we had as a community to do that. We were able to direct our own city funds in a way that addressed racial equity and started trying to tie development to public benefit. But like, we just need better tools at the local level to be able to do those things better.
so in the interest of time, Tim, we're a pretty open bunch. So if you wanted to email, we can follow up and have this conversation, continue it on there.
All good.
Matt,
Thank you.
yeah, no, thanks. Matt, do you have a question or anything? We're running out of time.
Sure, I'll keep it brief. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Lisa. I've been a fan of your work for a while. I'm a Bloomington, Indiana city council member in my second term. Basically got involved in advocacy and then ran for office on this set of issues and a few others. And yeah, we're making some progress, but we're also struggling too. And a big part of that is kind of the voices that are in the room and the folks who don't have any, power or aren't even aware of the issues. And you mentioned something earlier that I was curious to hear more about or know where to follow up, which was actually directing staff to develop and then voting on your engagement approach for, I think, the 2040 plan. And so as we're considering possible reforms to our comprehensive plan and unified development ordinance, for instance, without intention, it will be the loudest, most privileged voices who will oppose it, and it will be difficult to move on because it changes the entire conversation. But we know there is broad support for the goals that we're trying to accomplish with these, evidence-based tools. But like, yeah, I was really intrigued by that. So I don't know if there's anything you can point me to or any best practice guidelines out there that you would have recommendations or thoughts about with respect to how to build in more equitable engagement intentionally into, these conversations.
I really feel like this should be just like a best practice for any multi-year process, is to, at the beginning, like adopt a timeline and a general kind of scope for the engagement at least. And, it's probably similar in a lot of places, but we specifically had city-funded neighborhood organizations in Minneapolis that historically had a very large role in determining the local zoning and land use policies in each neighborhood in the city. So we needed to explicitly shift away from that expectation that if you joined your neighborhood board during this 2-year period, you got to write the zoning code for your neighborhood, because that is obviously not an appropriate way to set public policy, right? And it's not fair to those people. It's not fair to the bigger community. And so and that's a very simplified version, obviously, but we had to very explicitly set the expectation for how these important partners, our neighborhood organizations, were would help us engage with a broader community, but also set the expectation that we needed to do a citywide approach. We were going to engage with cultural communities in languages other than English very explicitly. We were going to do broad engagement that included multiple ways for people to get involved. So we really, and we can find you the specific document. I'm not sure if, that was a while ago, so there's probably emerged best practices since then. But, I think the important part was that we were protecting kind of ourselves, like the city as a whole, by saying we all agree that this is what we're going to do. And here's some ways we're going to change very explicitly. And also that there was some bounds on what we would ask staff to do. And that if we were sending our city, we were investing a ton of time, right? If we were asking our planning department staff or a consultant or someone to do all these neighborhood meetings, it's a huge investment for the city. So we had to make sure we weren't getting to the end and like half the council's like, oh, you didn't talk to like these 4 people and now I'm not going to support the plan. We have to start over. That kind of stuff really, really degrades trust and causes all kinds of problems. So to me, I feel like it's one opportunity to put some bounds on what's our basic timeline? How are we going to engage? Things tend to get delayed. And that's actually another way that inequity continues over time, because obviously a lot of folks in community don't have like 3 years of their lives to dedicate to a planning process. So the longer something goes on and the more delayed it becomes, often, you're left with people who had a ton of time and energy and capacity to be able to stay with it. So I feel like those principles are important to outline, but then also like attaching, like how much staff time do we actually have to do engagement and how do we best use that resource? And are we all on the same page? And then like, as we get to the end and we vote, it's like, oh, okay, remember we said this. Remember we said we were going to do 3 community meetings and 4 focus groups and whatever, the online survey, and we did those things. And so if we're going to ask for more, then it's like, what do we take off staff's plate, or how do we give more resources to this? Because I think that is part of the constant tension between community policymakers and like the staff, the bureaucracy or the government agencies is that relationship being as transparent and built on trust as possible.
Thank you.
Right.
I know I'm not giving short answers, so
So I'm cutting you off, Lisa.
Yeah.
Lisa, thanks so much. Well, thank everybody for joining us. Lisa, thanks so much. This is just always a pleasure to talk to you more. And like I said, for folks, please feel free to reach out to Climate Cabinet and see with other questions. And also, I'll be providing this as a podcast if you wanted to share it as well. So thanks, everybody. See you later.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. And if folks have specific questions, please reach out. I know we talked kind of high level general today, so happy to talk about the details in the future.
Great.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Cool.
Good to see you all.
Yep. Good to see you. Thanks. Yep. Bye.